While Nazi soldiers marched through the cobblestone streets of a Polish city, checking documents and dragging Jewish families to their deaths, there was a Catholic priest who looked down at the stone floor beneath his own feet and thought of something impossible. Not a prayer, not a sermon, but a plan that would make him one of the most wanted men by the Third Reich. This priest wasn't just hiding people in his basement. He was building an entire city underground, a labyrinth of tunnels, rooms and secret passages that would shelter hundreds of Jews right beneath the heels of Nazi boots. And the most insane part? The Germans never knew. For years, while the Gestapo searched every house, every attic, every hole looking for hidden Jews, there was an entire community breathing, eating, sleeping and living in absolute silence just a few meters below the ground. This is the story Hollywood never told. The story of a man who defied evil not with weapons, but with shovels, faith and a will of steel that refused to break even when death knocked on his door every single day. The year was 1942, and the city of Przemyśl in southeastern Poland had become a living nightmare. This wasn't just another occupied town. This was a strategic prize for the Nazis, a railway hub that connected the Eastern Front to the heart of the Third Reich. Before the war, Przemyśl was home to nearly 17,000 Jews, almost one-third of the entire population. The city had been a melting pot for centuries, where Catholic Poles and Jewish families lived side by side, shared the same streets, bought bread from the same bakeries. But when the Wehrmacht rolled in during September of 1939, that world ended overnight. The occupation didn't start with gas chambers, it started with humiliation, yellow stars sewn onto coats, curfews, rations cut to starvation levels, Jewish businesses marked, then looted, then burned, and then came the ghetto. By the summer of 1942, the Nazis had crammed nearly 24,000 Jews into a suffocating section of the city, a prison with invisible walls where disease, hunger and despair became the only certainties. The deportations to Belzec extermination camp had already begun, and everyone knew what that meant. The trains that left packed with people never came back. In the middle of this hell stood a man named Ignacy Chrzanowski, a Catholic priest in his early 50s, who ran a small religious school on the outskirts of the ghetto. Father Chrzanowski was not a warrior. He was not a soldier. He was a teacher, a quiet man with round glasses and a soft voice who had spent his life studying theology and teaching children about compassion. But when the deportations started, when he saw families torn apart on the streets, when he heard the screams echoing from the railway station, something inside him changed. He made a decision that would either save hundreds of lives or get him executed in the town square. He would not stand by. He would not pray and hope for mercy from a regime that had none. He would act. And his weapon would be the one thing the Nazis never thought to search: the ground itself. The plan was born out of desperation and genius. Beneath the school where Father Chrzanowski taught, there was a small cellar used for storing potatoes and coal. It was damp, dark, and unremarkable. But the priest saw something else. He saw possibility. He saw salvation. With the help of a handful of trusted students and a few brave locals, he began to dig. Not just a hiding spot, not just a cellar, but a network. Night after night, while Nazi patrols walked above, the sound of shovels scraping against stone echoed in the darkness below. They dug through clay, through rock, through frozen earth in the winter cold. They built rooms. They carved out passageways. They reinforced walls with stolen timber and created ventilation shafts disguised as drainage pipes. And as the underground city grew, so did the number of people who needed it. By the time the Gestapo intensified their raids in late 1942, Father Chrzanowski's underground network had become a lifeline. Families who had received deportation notices would disappear in the night, slipping through secret entrances in barns, basements, and even a fake grave in the cemetery. They descended into the earth and vanished from Nazi records. Below ground, life was hard, but it was life. There were sleeping quarters, a makeshift kitchen, a small room used as a synagogue where prayers were whispered so softly they could barely be heard. Children learned to walk without making noise. Mothers learned to cover their babies' mouths when patrols passed overhead. Every creak, every footstep above was a reminder that discovery meant death, not just for those hiding, but for the priest and everyone who helped him. The Nazis knew Jews were being hidden. They conducted raids, interrogations, and house-to-house searches with ruthless efficiency. But they never imagined that beneath their feet, beneath the streets they controlled, beneath the very buildings where they held their meetings, an entire community was surviving in defiance of the Third Reich. And Father Chrzanowski, the quiet teacher with round glasses, had become the architect of the impossible. The transformation of Przemyśl into a death trap happened faster than anyone could have imagined. By the spring of 1942, the Nazi occupation had moved beyond oppression into something far more sinister: systematic extermination. The ghetto that had been established just months earlier was now operating under a single, horrifying purpose. It wasn't designed to contain Jews, it was designed to process them for murder. Every few weeks, the SS would seal off sections of the ghetto, round up hundreds of people, and march them to the railway station where cattle cars waited with doors wide open. The destination was always the same: Przemyśl, a name that meant nothing to most people outside Poland, but to those inside the ghetto, it was synonymous with oblivion. Families tried to hide during these roundups, cramming themselves into attics, crawling into sewers, burying themselves under piles of garbage. But the Nazis were thorough. They brought dogs, they used informants, they set buildings on fire to flush people out, and they always filled their quota. Father Chrzanowski watched this horror unfold from his school, which sat just outside the ghetto walls. Every morning he could hear the screams. Every night he could see the glow of fires where homes had been torched. He had already been helping in small ways, smuggling food into the ghetto, forging baptismal certificates to give Jewish children Christian identities, hiding families for a night or two in his cellar. But he knew these efforts were temporary, fragile, and ultimately insufficient. The deportations were accelerating. The Nazis were emptying the ghetto faster than anyone could have predicted. If he didn't act now, if he didn't create something permanent, everyone he knew inside those walls would be dead within months. That's when the idea took hold. Not just a hiding place, not just a temporary shelter, but a permanent underground refuge where people could disappear completely, where they could survive not for days, but for years if necessary. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It was the only option left. The construction of the underground city required more than just courage. It required logistics, secrecy, and an almost superhuman ability to coordinate under constant surveillance. Father Chrzanowski couldn't do this alone. He needed help, and he found it in the most unlikely places. There was Władysław, a former coal miner who knew how to dig without causing cave-ins. There was Maria, a schoolteacher who helped smuggle children out of the ghetto by hiding them in laundry carts. There was Tomasz, a local carpenter who built fake walls and hidden doors that even the Gestapo's trained eyes couldn't detect. Together, they formed a network, a secret resistance operating not with guns or bombs, but with shovels, hammers, and an unshakable belief that every life saved was a victory against the Reich. They worked at night, always at night, when the patrols were lighter and the noise of their digging could be masked by the wind or the distant rumble of trains. The entrance to the underground city was a masterpiece of deception. It wasn't hidden in some remote forest or abandoned building. It was right there in plain sight beneath the floor of Father Chrzanowski's school. The main access point was concealed under a large bookshelf in his private study, a bookshelf so heavy it required 3 men to move. Once moved, it revealed a trap door that led down into darkness. But there were other entrances too, scattered throughout the city. A false bottom in a coal shed, a drainage pipe in the cemetery that led to a tunnel, a removable stone in the wall of a barn. Each entrance was designed to be used once, maybe twice, before being sealed and abandoned. The idea was simple. If the Nazis discovered one entrance, they wouldn't find the others. The network would survive, even if parts of it were compromised. By mid-1942, the first families began arriving. They came in the dead of night, guided by whispers and coded messages. A knock on a door, a password exchanged. A hurried descent into the earth. At first, there were only a dozen people living below ground, But as the deportations intensified, as the ghetto shrank and the trains came more frequently, the numbers grew. 20 people. 50. 100. The underground city expanded to meet the demand. New rooms carved out, new tunnels dug, new ventilation shafts disguised as innocent drainage systems. And above ground, the Nazis continued their work, completely unaware that beneath their boots, beneath their command posts, beneath the very streets they patrolled, hundreds of Jews were living, breathing, and surviving in silent defiance. Life underground was not romantic. It was not an adventure. It was survival in its rawest, most brutal form. The tunnels were narrow, barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through without scraping his shoulders against the dirt walls. The air was thick, damp, and smelled of earth and sweat. There was no sunlight, no sense of day or night, only the dim glow of a few candles that had to be rationed, because even candles were a luxury that could get someone killed if discovered. The temperature underground was constant, cold in a way that seeped into your bones and never left. People slept on wooden boards covered with whatever fabric they could salvage, thin blankets, torn coats, anything to create a barrier between their bodies and the frozen ground. Children shivered through the nights, pressed against their mothers for warmth. The elderly suffered the most, their joints aching, their lungs struggling in the thin air. But no one complained. Complaint was a privilege reserved for the living above ground, and everyone below knew they no longer belonged to that world. The logistics of keeping hundreds of people alive underground were staggering. Food was the first and most constant problem. Father Chrzanowski and his network had to smuggle provisions into the tunnels without arousing suspicion, a task that became exponentially harder as Nazi checkpoints multiplied and rationing grew tighter. They used every trick imaginable. Bread was hidden inside hollowed-out logs. Potatoes were stuffed into the lining of coats. Jars of preserved vegetables were buried in false-bottom crates, labeled as coal or tools. The priest himself would visit the ghetto under the pretense of offering religious comfort, but hidden beneath his robes were packets of dried meat, small bags of flour, anything that could sustain life for another day. Water was slightly easier, but no less dangerous. The underground city had access to a natural spring that fed into the tunnels, a stroke of luck that Father Chrzanowski considered divine intervention. But the spring had to be carefully managed, rationed, because too much use would create drainage problems that could be noticed above ground. Silence was the most sacred rule of the underground city. Everyone understood that a single scream, a single loud cough, a crying baby could doom them all. Mothers learned to breastfeed their infants with a hand gently covering their mouths, ready to muffle any sound. Children were taught from the moment they arrived that noise meant death, not just for them but for everyone. They learned to communicate in whispers, in gestures, in a language of survival that required no words. When Nazi patrols passed overhead, which happened multiple times a day, everyone froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, movements ceased. Even breathing became shallow, controlled, deliberate. The sound of boots on cobblestones above would echo down through the earth, a reminder that the enemy was always close, always listening, always hunting. And in those moments, the underground city became a tomb of living ghosts, silent and still, waiting for the danger to pass. The psychological toll was immense. People who had once lived normal lives, who had owned shops and raised families and walked freely under the sun, were now reduced to shadows, living in perpetual darkness. There was no privacy. Families slept inches apart from strangers. The smell of unwashed bodies became overwhelming. Disease was a constant threat: dysentery, typhus, infections from cuts that had no way to heal properly in the filth and damp. Father Chrzanowski tried to maintain morale by organizing quiet prayer sessions, by reminding people that their survival was an act of resistance, that every day they remained alive was a day Hitler failed. But hope was hard to sustain when you couldn't see the sky, when you didn't know if the war would end in a month or a decade, when every sound above ground could be the sound of discovery. And yet, despite everything, the underground city functioned. Roles were assigned, some people cooked, rationing the meager supplies into meals that kept everyone alive. Others maintained the tunnels, reinforcing weak spots, digging new air shafts when the oxygen grew too thin. A few men served as lookouts, positioned near the hidden entrances, listening for any sign of danger. There was even a makeshift school where children were taught in whispers, their education continuing in the darkness because their parents refused to let the Nazis steal their future. The underground city was not just a hiding place, it was a defiant assertion of humanity in the face of annihilation. And Father Chrzanowski, the quiet priest with round glasses, had become the shepherd of this impossible flock. The Gestapo knew something was wrong. They couldn't pinpoint it, couldn't prove it, but their instincts told them that too many Jews were vanishing without a trace. The numbers didn't add up. During the deportations, they would sweep the ghetto and round up hundreds, sometimes thousands, but there were always discrepancies. Families listed on their registries would simply disappear. Buildings that should have contained dozens of people would turn up empty. The SS officers blamed it on faulty record-keeping, on Jews escaping into the forests, on partisan activity in the surrounding countryside. But a few sharper minds within the Gestapo began to suspect something more organized, something closer to home. They intensified their searches. They brought in specially trained dogs to sniff out hidden compartments. They interrogated locals with increasing brutality, breaking bones and extracting teeth to get information. But no one talked. The people of Przemyśl who knew about the underground city understood that speaking meant death, not just for themselves, but for everyone they loved. The silence held, but the pressure was mounting. Father Chrzanowski felt the walls closing in, literally and figuratively. The Gestapo had begun focusing their attention on religious institutions, convinced that priests and nuns were part of the resistance network. They weren't wrong. Churches across Poland were hiding Jews, smuggling children, forging documents. But most were doing it in small numbers, a family here, a child there. What Father Chrzanowski was doing was on a completely different scale, and he knew that if the Nazis ever discovered the true scope of his operation, the consequences would be apocalyptic. He had already survived 2 interrogations. The first was routine, a Nazi officer asking questions about suspicious activity near the school. Father Chrzanowski played the role of a confused, harmless old man, stammering through answers, showing them his empty classrooms, his sparse living quarters. They left unconvinced, but without evidence. The second interrogation was more aggressive. They accused him directly of hiding Jews. They threatened him with execution. But the priest held firm, his voice never wavering, his story never changing. He was a man of God, he told them. His only mission was to serve Christ, not to meddle in politics or war. They didn't believe him, but again they had no proof. The underground city adapted to the increased scrutiny. New protocols were established. Entrances were used even less frequently, sometimes going weeks without being opened. Food drops became more sporadic, forcing the people below to survive on smaller and smaller rations. The priest began using children as couriers, calculating that Nazi soldiers were less likely to search a 10-year-old boy carrying a sack of potatoes. It was a horrifying gamble, putting children in danger, but it was also brutally effective. The children learned their roots, learned the coded phrases, learned how to act innocent even when their hearts were pounding with terror. They became ghosts moving through the city, invisible to the occupiers, carrying the lifeline that kept the underground city alive. Some of these children were Jewish themselves, their appearances Aryan enough to pass, their courage far beyond their years. But the most dangerous moment came in the winter of 1943. A collaborator, a Polish man who had been feeding information to the Gestapo in exchange for extra food rations, claimed he had seen suspicious activity near the cemetery. He reported seeing people entering a drainage tunnel late at night, people who never came out. The Gestapo took the report seriously. They assembled a unit, brought explosives, and prepared to blast open the tunnel and flood it with poison gas. The plan was set for dawn, but the collaborator made one critical mistake. He bragged about his discovery to a woman at a local tavern, trying to impress her, trying to show off his importance. That woman happened to be Maria, the schoolteacher who worked with Father Chrzanowski. She left the tavern immediately, ran through the frozen streets and reached the priest just after midnight. They had less than 6 hours to act. Father Chrzanowski didn't panic. He couldn't afford to. He gathered his most trusted helpers and made a decision that would either save everyone or doom them all. They would abandon the cemetery entrance entirely, seal it from the inside, and make it look like it had never been used. They worked through the night, collapsing parts of the tunnel, filling it with debris, covering their tracks. By the time the Gestapo arrived at dawn with their explosives and their gas canisters, they found nothing but a caved-in drainage pipe, old and decrepit, clearly unused for years. The officer in charge was furious. He pistol-whipped the collaborator for wasting their time, accused him of chasing ghosts. The collaborator insisted he had seen people, insisted he was telling the truth. But without evidence, the Gestapo moved on. The underground city had survived by mere hours. The close call at the cemetery changed everything. Father Chrzanowski realized that luck alone would not sustain them. The Nazis were getting smarter, more paranoid, more willing to tear the city apart stone by stone to find their hidden prey. The priest needed to think 3 steps ahead, to anticipate every possible threat before it materialized. So he did something radical. He decided to expand the underground city not outward, but deeper. If the Gestapo was searching basements and drainage tunnels, then the solution was to go beyond their imagination, to create layers beneath layers, a network so complex and so deep that even if they discovered one level, they would never suspect there was another below it. The digging intensified. New teams were formed, working in shifts, carving through clay and bedrock with tools that were primitive and inadequate, but wielded with desperate determination. They dug down 15 feet, then 20, then 30. At that depth, the earth was harder, more stable, but also more suffocating. The air was thinner. The dampness turned to underground streams that had to be channeled away. But the depth provided something invaluable: invisibility. At 30 feet below the surface, the sounds of digging could not be heard above ground. The underground city had found its sanctuary in the abyss. Communication became the next challenge. With multiple levels and dozens of tunnels branching in different directions, people needed a way to navigate without getting lost in the darkness. Father Chrzanowski devised a system of markings, subtle scratches on the tunnel walls that indicated direction and destination. A single vertical line meant you were heading toward the main chamber. 2 horizontal lines meant you were near a water source. A circle with a cross inside meant danger, an area that was unstable or too close to the surface. Only those who lived underground knew how to read these marks. To anyone else, they would look like random scratches, the natural erosion of time and earth. The system worked, but it required discipline and memory. Children were taught the markings as if learning a new alphabet. Lives depended on knowing the difference between a safe tunnel and a dead end that could trap you in a collapse. The psychological strain of living underground for months, sometimes over a year, began to show in devastating ways. There were people who simply stopped speaking, their minds retreating into silence as a defense against the unbearable reality. There were others who became obsessed with counting the drips of water from the ceiling, counting the number of breaths they took, counting the days they had been buried alive. A woman named Rachel, who had been a vibrant baker before the war, began clawing at the dirt walls with her bare hands, trying to dig her way out, convinced that if she just dug far enough, she would reach sunlight again. It took 3 people to restrain her, to calm her, to remind her that going up meant death. She eventually stopped clawing, but her hands remained scarred, her eyes hollow. Father Chrzanowski tried to provide spiritual comfort, but even he struggled to find words that could ease the crushing weight of despair. How do you tell someone to have faith when they haven't seen the sky in 18 months? Yet, amid the darkness, there were moments of startling humanity. A young couple got married underground, their vows whispered in the presence of 20 witnesses who stood in silence, unable to clap or cheer, but whose eyes shone with tears of joy. The ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes, but it was a defiant declaration that life continued, that love existed even in hell. A baby was born in the tunnels, delivered by a woman who had been a midwife before the war. The birth was complicated, the mother hemorrhaging, the baby barely breathing. But both survived. The infant's first cry was muffled by a blanket, but everyone who heard it felt something they hadn't felt in months. Hope. That baby, born in darkness, represented the future. A future the Nazis were trying to erase but couldn't reach. Father Chrzanowski baptized the child in a small ceremony, using water from the underground spring, and named him Ezra, a name that meant help. Because that's what they all needed. Help, deliverance, salvation. As 1943 dragged into 1944, the war began to shift. News filtered down into the tunnels, whispered from above by the priest and his helpers. The Allies had landed in Italy. The Soviets were pushing west. The Germans were losing ground, slowly but undeniably. For the first time since the underground city was built, there was a reason to believe that survival was not just a fantasy, but a real possibility. But hope was dangerous. Hope made people careless. And in the spring of 1944, that carelessness nearly destroyed everything Father Chrzanowski had built. The mistake happened on a Tuesday morning in April of 1944. A young man named David, barely 19 years old, had been living underground for over a year. He had watched his parents dragged onto a deportation train. He had held his younger sister as she died from typhus in the tunnels. He had endured cold, hunger, and darkness with the same grim determination as everyone else. But that morning, something inside him snapped. Maybe it was the news of Allied victories. Maybe it was the suffocating despair of another day without sunlight. Whatever the reason, David decided he couldn't stay below ground any longer. He told no one of his plan. In the early hours when most people were asleep and the guards near the entrances were drowsy, he slipped through one of the access tunnels and emerged into the world above. He didn't run. He didn't try to escape the city. He simply stood there, in an alley behind a burned-out building, breathing fresh air and staring at the pale morning sky as if seeing it for the first time. He stood there for 10 minutes, maybe 15, and that was enough. A Nazi patrol spotted him. 2 soldiers on a routine sweep, bored and looking for something to justify their morning report. They saw a filthy young man covered in dirt, standing in an alley where no one should be at that hour. They approached with rifles raised, shouting questions. David froze. He tried to explain that he was just a worker, that he had been cleaning cellars, but his story was weak and his appearance damning. The soldiers didn't believe him. They grabbed him, searched him, and found nothing incriminating except the dirt under his fingernails and the desperate look in his eyes. That was enough for suspicion. They dragged him to the local Gestapo headquarters for interrogation, and David, exhausted and broken, made the worst possible decision. He talked. Not immediately, not after the first beating, but after hours of torture, after his fingernails were ripped out one by one, after his ribs were cracked and his face became unrecognizable. He told them about the tunnels. He told them about the underground city. He told them about Father Chrzanowski. The Gestapo moved quickly. They assembled a full SS unit, brought in engineers and explosives, and prepared for a raid that would finally end the mystery of the disappearing Jews. They planned to hit every entrance simultaneously, to flood the tunnels with gas, to collapse the entire network and bury everyone alive. The operation was scheduled for dawn the next day, but David, even in his broken state, had one last shred of humanity left. As the Gestapo officers left him chained in a cell, bleeding and barely conscious, he managed to whisper a warning to a Polish janitor who was cleaning the hallway. The janitor, a man named Piotr who had secretly been helping the resistance, understood immediately. He left the building, walked calmly to avoid suspicion, and as soon as he was out of sight, he ran. He ran through the streets, through checkpoints, lying to guards until he reached Father Chrzanowski's school. He arrived just after midnight. He was gasping, barely able to speak, but his message was clear. They had less than 6 hours before the raid. Father Chrzanowski didn't hesitate. There was no time for panic, no time for despair. He descended into the tunnels and began waking people, quietly, methodically. He told them the situation. He told them they had to evacuate immediately. But evacuate to where? The underground city had been their fortress, their only hope. Now it was a trap. The priest had anticipated this moment, had planned for it even though he prayed it would never come. There was one tunnel, a rarely used passage that extended beyond the city limits and emerged in a forested area nearly 2 miles away. It was narrow, unstable, and had never been tested with large numbers of people. But it was their only chance. He began organizing the evacuation, sending people in small groups, spacing them out to avoid panic and tunnel collapses. The elderly went first, then the children, then the able-bodied adults. It was a controlled chaos, silent and terrifying. As the evacuation proceeded, Father Chrzanowski remained at the main entrance, ensuring everyone got out. He was the last line of defense, the shepherd who would not abandon his flock. By 4 in the morning, most people had escaped into the forest tunnel, but there were still a dozen stragglers, people too weak to move quickly, a mother with a newborn, an old man who could barely walk. The priest stayed with them, guiding them, carrying some when necessary. Above ground, the sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn was approaching. The Gestapo would arrive any moment. Father Chrzanowski could hear the distant rumble of trucks, the barking of dogs. He pushed the last person into the tunnel and was about to follow when he heard boots on the floor above. They were here. Father Chrzanowski had seconds to decide. He could follow the others into the escape tunnel and seal it behind him, disappearing into the forest and leaving the Gestapo to find an empty network. Or he could stay and buy time, creating a diversion that might prevent the Nazis from discovering the escape route. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. If he ran, the Gestapo would tear apart every tunnel looking for survivors, and they would eventually find the forest passage. But if he stayed, if he gave them a target to focus on, if he became the prize they were hunting, the others might make it far enough to scatter and survive. He climbed back up through the main entrance, closed the trapdoor behind him, and moved the heavy bookshelf back into place. Then he sat down at his desk, opened a Bible, and waited. When the Gestapo kicked down his door 30 seconds later, they found him reading scripture by candlelight, as calm as if he were preparing for morning mass. The lead officer, a man named Klaus Müller, who had been hunting the underground network for months, smiled. He had finally found his priest. The interrogation was brutal and immediate. They didn't take him to headquarters. They did it right there, in his own study, surrounded by books and crosses and the symbols of a faith they despised. Müller wanted to know how many Jews were hiding. Where were the tunnels? Who else was involved? Father Chrzanowski said nothing. They beat him with rifle butts, breaking his jaw and shattering his glasses. They burned him with cigarettes, held against his hands and neck until the smell of charred flesh filled the room. They smashed his fingers with a hammer, one by one, turning his hands into mangled ruins. But the priest did not speak. He prayed silently, his lips moving but no sound emerging except the occasional gasp of pain. Müller grew frustrated. He had expected the priest to break quickly, to beg for mercy, to trade information for his life. But this man, this quiet teacher with blood running down his face, was not breaking. After 2 hours, Müller changed tactics. He ordered his men to start demolishing the school, tearing up floorboards, smashing through walls. If the priest wouldn't talk, they would find the tunnels themselves. They found the entrance within an hour. The bookshelf was too heavy, too deliberately placed. Once moved, the trapdoor was obvious. Müller's expression turned triumphant. He dragged Father Chrzanowski to the opening, forced him to look down into the darkness, and demanded to know how many Jews were down there. The priest, his face swollen and bloody, managed to speak through his broken jaw. He told Müller the truth. There was no one down there. They had all escaped. The officer didn't believe him. He ordered a team to descend, equipped with flashlights and grenades. They went down expecting to find hundreds of cowering Jews. Instead, they found empty rooms, scattered belongings, still warm candles, evidence of recent habitation but no people. The tunnels stretched in multiple directions, a labyrinth that would take hours to fully explore. Müller realized what had happened. They had been tipped off. The evacuation had been recent, perhaps within the last few hours. Someone had warned them. Müller's rage was volcanic. He screamed at his men, accused them of incompetence, and then turned that rage on Father Chrzanowski. If the Jews had escaped, then the priest would pay the price for all of them. Müller dragged him outside into the morning light, into the street where townspeople were beginning to emerge for the day. He wanted this to be public. He wanted this to be a message. A wooden post was erected in the town square, the same square where children used to play and merchants used to sell vegetables. Father Chrzanowski was tied to the post, his broken body barely able to stand. Müller gave a speech to the gathered crowd, declaring that this man was a traitor to the Reich, a criminal who had hidden enemies of Germany, and that his fate would serve as a warning to anyone else who considered defying Nazi authority. He asked the priest one final time if he would reveal the names of his collaborators, the people who had helped him build the underground city. Father Chrzanowski looked at the crowd, at the faces of people he had known for years, some of whom had helped him, some of whom had remained silent. He smiled through his broken teeth and said nothing. The execution was not quick. Müller wanted it to be prolonged, theatrical, a spectacle of suffering that would terrify the population into obedience. They did not shoot him. Instead, they beat him in front of the crowd, taking turns making it last. Father Chrzanowski endured it all without crying out, without begging, without giving them the satisfaction of his fear. He prayed. Even as his body failed, even as his vision blurred and his lungs struggled for air, he prayed. And when he finally died, slumped against the post, the town square was silent. Even some of the Nazi soldiers looked uncomfortable. They had killed a man who refused to break, and in doing so they had created something far more dangerous than any tunnel or hiding place. They had created a martyr. The survivors who had escaped through the forest tunnel heard about Father Chrzanowski's execution 3 days later. The news reached them through whispers, carried by sympathetic locals who risked their lives to bring food and information to the scattered groups hiding in the woods. Some wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process that the man who had saved their lives was gone. A few wanted to go back to honor him, to retrieve his body, but the elders among them, the ones who understood the mathematics of survival, forbade it. Going back meant death, and Father Chrzanowski had not sacrificed himself so they could throw their lives away on sentiment. His final act had been to buy them time, and they would honor that by staying alive, by scattering into the countryside, by surviving until the war ended. The forest became their new home, a cold and unforgiving place, but still better than the alternative. They split into smaller groups to avoid detection, some heading east toward Soviet-controlled territory, others west toward areas where partisan activity was stronger. They carried nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memory of a priest who had loved them more than his own life. Meanwhile, the Gestapo tore apart the underground city with methodical fury. They mapped every tunnel, documented every room, photographed the makeshift synagogue and the sleeping quarters and the hidden entrances. They were simultaneously impressed and enraged by the scale of what they found. This was not some hastily dug cellar. This was engineering, planning. A sustained effort that had required dozens of people working in coordination for years. Müller wrote a report to his superiors in Berlin, describing the network as one of the most sophisticated resistance operations he had encountered in occupied Poland. But the report was also an admission of failure. Despite finding the tunnels, despite executing the priest, they had captured no Jews. The operation had been a tactical success and a strategic disaster. The SS High Command was not pleased. Müller was quietly reassigned to the Eastern Front, a punishment disguised as a promotion. The underground city was ordered to be destroyed completely, filled with concrete and explosives to ensure it could never be used again. But the story of Father Chrzanowski's underground city didn't end with its destruction. It became a legend, whispered in ghetto remnants across Poland, shared among resistance fighters, passed from one desperate family to another. The fact that a Catholic priest had hidden hundreds of Jews, that he had built an entire city beneath the earth, that he had died without betraying a single name, became a source of hope in a time when hope was nearly extinct. Other priests and nuns, inspired by his example, began their own rescue efforts. Convents opened their doors. Monasteries created false records. Churches hid children in bell towers and crypts. The ripple effect of Father Chrzanowski's courage spread far beyond Przemyśl, saving lives in ways he would never know. The Nazis tried to suppress the story, forbidding anyone from speaking his name. But you cannot suppress a story that people need to believe in. The underground city became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, there were people who chose light. The war dragged on for another year. By the summer of 1944, The Soviet army was pushing into Poland, liberating cities and uncovering the full horror of what the Nazis had done. Przemyśl was liberated in late July. When Soviet soldiers entered the city, they found it half destroyed, its population decimated, its Jewish community almost entirely erased. But they also found survivors. People who had been hidden in the forests, in barns, in the homes of righteous Gentiles, who had risked everything to shelter them. And among those survivors were over 200 people who owed their lives to an underground city that no longer existed. They emerged from the woods, gaunt and scarred but alive. They returned to Przemyśl to find the school where Father Chrzanowski had taught reduced to rubble. The Nazis had burned it before retreating, erasing the physical evidence of what had happened there. But the survivors remembered. They gathered in the town square, the same square where the priest had been executed, and they placed stones on the ground where his blood had been spilled. It was a Jewish tradition, leaving stones on graves. Father Chrzanowski was not Jewish, but he had earned that honor. The true scale of what he had accomplished only became clear in the years after the war. Researchers, historians, and survivors began piecing together testimonies, documenting names, mapping the tunnels that had been filled with concrete. The numbers were staggering. Over the course of 2 years, Father Ignacy Chrzanowski and his network had sheltered and saved approximately 768 Jews, making his underground city one of the largest and most successful rescue operations in Nazi-occupied Europe. 768 lives, each one a universe of possibility, each one a defiance of Hitler's final solution. And yet, for decades, almost no one knew his name. After the war ended, the survivors scattered across the globe. Some stayed in Poland trying to rebuild lives in a country that had become a graveyard. Others emigrated to Israel, to America, to anywhere that would take them, carrying their trauma and their memories to distant shores. But no matter where they went, they carried the story of Father Chrzanowski with them. They told their children about the priest who built a city underground. They told their grandchildren about the tunnels that saved their lives. They gathered on anniversaries, first in small groups, then in larger reunions as the decades passed, and they spoke his name like a prayer. But outside of these survivor communities, the story remained largely unknown. Poland was under Soviet control for nearly 50 years after the war, and the communist government was not interested in promoting stories of Catholic heroism. The official narrative focused on Soviet liberation and communist resistance, leaving little room for a priest who didn't fit the ideological mold. Father Chrzanowski's story was buried, not under earth this time, but under politics and bureaucracy. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening of archives, that historians began uncovering the full extent of what had happened in Przemyśl. Documents emerged, testimonies were collected, survivors who had remained silent for decades finally felt safe enough to speak. A Polish researcher named Anna Wojcik spent 5 years tracking down everyone she could find who had been part of the underground city, or who had helped Father Chrzanowski. She interviewed over 100 people, many of them in their 80s and 90s, racing against time to preserve their stories before they were lost forever. What she discovered was breathtaking. The underground network had been even more extensive than anyone realized. There were tunnels that stretched for nearly 3 miles, connecting multiple buildings across the city. There were supply routes that had operated for over 2 years without detection. There were false identities, forged documents, and a communication system so sophisticated that the Gestapo never fully cracked it even after they discovered the tunnels. Wojcik's research led to a movement to officially recognize Father Chrzanowski's heroism. In 1995, exactly 50 years after the war ended, he was posthumously awarded the title of Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. The honor is given only to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Nazi era. Father Chrzanowski's name was added to the Wall of Honor in Jerusalem, alongside thousands of other rescuers whose courage stood against the tide of hatred. But even this recognition didn't bring his story to the wider world. Yad Vashem honors thousands of people. The award ceremony was small, attended mostly by survivors and their families. The media barely covered it. Father Chrzanowski remained a footnote in history, known to those he saved but invisible to everyone else. The real breakthrough came in 2008, when a documentary filmmaker named Michael Brenner stumbled upon the story while researching a different project. Brenner was making a film about Catholic-Jewish relations during the Holocaust and came across a brief mention of the underground city in an archived interview. He was immediately hooked. He tracked down Wojciech's research, interviewed the remaining survivors, and spent 3 years filming a documentary titled The City Beneath. The film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and won multiple awards. It was broadcast on PBS on European networks, and suddenly people around the world were learning about Father Chrzanowski for the first time. The story resonated because it was so improbable, so cinematic, so deeply human. A priest digging tunnels beneath Nazi boots. Hundreds of people living in silence underground, a sacrifice that saved nearly 800 lives. It was the kind of story that sounded too extraordinary to be true, except it was true, documented, verified by testimonies and archival evidence. Following the documentary's success, the city of Przemyśl began efforts to preserve what remained of the underground network. Parts of the tunnels had been filled with concrete by the Nazis, but other sections had simply been sealed and forgotten. In 2012, a team of archaeologists and engineers began carefully excavating, mapping, and stabilizing the tunnels. What they found was astonishing. Rooms still contained remnants of life from 70 years earlier. A child's shoe, a prayer book, candle stubs melted into the dirt floor, scratches on the walls marking days, weeks, months. The excavation became a museum project. In 2015, the Chrzanowski Underground Museum opened to the public, allowing visitors to descend into the actual tunnels and walk through the rooms where families had hidden. It became one of the most visited Holocaust memorial sites in Poland, a place where history was not just told, but physically experienced. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Father Chrzanowski's actions has been the ripple effect on how people think about courage and moral responsibility. His story has been taught in schools, featured in books, and referenced in discussions about what it means to resist evil. He was not a soldier. He was not a politician. He was a teacher, a quiet man with no special training in resistance or warfare. And yet, when confronted with atrocity, he chose to act. He didn't wait for someone else to save the Jews of Przemyśl. He didn't rationalize inaction by saying he was just one person who couldn't make a difference. He picked up a shovel and started digging. And that choice, multiplied by 2 years of relentless work, saved 768 lives. His story asks a question that echoes across generations. When faced with injustice, what will you do? Today, if you visit Przemyśl, you can stand in the town square where Father Ignacy Chrzanowski was executed. There's a memorial there now, a simple stone marker with his name and the dates of his birth and death. Nearby, a plaque lists the names of those who helped him, the teachers, the miners, the ordinary people who risked everything to dig tunnels and smuggle food and keep secrets that could have gotten them killed. But what strikes visitors most is not the memorial itself, it's the realization of scale, of when you stand in that square and look around at the buildings, at the streets, at the ordinary cityscape of modern Poland, it's almost impossible to imagine that beneath your feet, 70 feet below where you're standing, hundreds of people once lived in total darkness and silence. The underground city is still there, preserved now, but once it was a living, breathing act of defiance that the world forgot for half a century. The question that haunts this story is the simplest and most painful one. Why don't we know about Father Chrzanowski the way we know about Oskar Schindler or Raoul Wallenberg? Why did his story take 50 years to emerge from the shadows? Part of the answer is timing. Schindler's story was told by survivors who emigrated to the West and had the platforms to share their experiences. Wallenberg's story became tangled in Cold War politics, which paradoxically kept it in the spotlight. But Father Chrzanowski operated in a region that fell behind the Iron Curtain, where Catholic heroism was politically inconvenient for communist authorities. The survivors he saved were scattered, many rebuilding their lives in silence, not yet ready to revisit the trauma. And the priest himself left no writings, no diary, no memoir. He was not interested in being remembered. He was interested in saving lives. That humility, that complete absence of ego, meant his story had no champion, no one pushing it into the historical record until decades had passed. But there's a deeper reason why stories like Father Chrzanowski's are often forgotten, and it has to do with how we prefer our heroes. We like our Holocaust rescuers to be dramatic, to fit neat narratives. Schindler was a flawed businessman who found redemption. Wallenberg was a diplomat who used official power to save thousands. These are stories with clear arcs, with protagonists who fit familiar molds. Father Chrzanowski doesn't fit that mold. He was quiet, unglamorous, methodical. His heroism wasn't a single dramatic act, but a sustained, grinding effort that lasted years. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, just endless nights of digging dirt and rationing bread and whispering prayers in the darkness. That kind of heroism is harder to romanticize, harder to package into a 2-hour movie or a catchy headline, but it's also more real, more accessible, more human. Father Chrzanowski proves that you don't need to be extraordinary to do extraordinary things. You just need to be willing. The survivors of the underground city, those still alive today, will tell you that Father Chrzanowski never saw himself as a hero. When they thanked him, when they tried to express their gratitude in the tunnels or after the war, he would wave them off, embarrassed. He would say he was simply doing what any decent person would do, though of course that wasn't true. Most people didn't do what he did. Most people looked away, stayed silent, prioritized their own safety. Not because they were evil, but because courage is rare and the cost of resistance was death. Father Chrzanowski chose differently, and that choice cost him everything. His body was never properly buried. The Nazis left him in an unmarked grave, wanting to erase even his corpse from history. But you cannot erase a legacy written in the lives of 768 people and all their descendants, thousands of souls who exist today because one man refused to accept that evil was inevitable. The story of the underground city matters now more than ever, because it reminds us that atrocities don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because ordinary people allow them to happen, because bystanders become accomplices through their silence. The Holocaust succeeded not just because of Nazi ideology, but because millions of people across Europe chose not to see, not to act, not to risk themselves for their neighbors. Father Chrzanowski and the people who helped him represent the opposite choice. They saw the evil unfolding around them and decided that inaction was not an option. They didn't wait for governments to intervene or armies to liberate. They grabbed shovels and started digging, and in doing so, they created a monument far more powerful than any stone memorial. They created a testament to the idea that even in humanity's darkest hour, there are always people who will choose light. So the next time you walk down a city street, any city street, remember that history isn't just written in the buildings you can see. It's written in the spaces beneath your feet, in the forgotten tunnels and hidden rooms where people once fought for survival. Remember that heroism doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and medals. Sometimes it whispers in the dark, in the sound of a shovel scraping against stone, in the quiet determination of a priest who believed that every life was worth saving. And remember Father Ignacy Chrzanowski, the man who built a city underground and saved hundreds of lives not because he wanted to be remembered, but because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. His story was buried for decades, but now it's yours to carry forward, to share, to ensure that his sacrifice and the sacrifice of everyone who helped him is never forgotten again.